Hi, my name is Aubrey Bertram. I'm the Eastern Montana Field Director with Montana Wilderness Association. I use she, her pronouns. And I just wanted to thank you so much for watching this recording on public lands and oil and gas leasing. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get the PowerPoint going. All right, wonderful. Well, first, again, thank you for joining us. An introduction on Montana Wilderness Association. We are a community of people who love the outdoors here in Montana, and we champion our wild places. We work with communities across Montana to protect our wilderness heritage, quiet beauty, and outdoor traditions now and for future generations. So in that vein, today we're talking about public lands and oil and gas leasing, how oil and gas leasing turns public lands and resources over to private companies for pennies on the dollar, and what we can do about it. So a brief outline of what we're going to cover today. We're going to talk about the 1920 Mineral Leasing Act, the 1974 Federal Land Management and Policy Act, the 1987 amendments to the Mineral Leasing Act that brought about the structure of leasing that we have today. We're going to cover some of the basics of lease sale processes, and we're going to spend the bulk of our time really talking about the problem of non-competitive leasing of our public resources to private companies. And then we're going to kind of bring it home and put it all in place with the Lewistown BLM planning area here in central Montana. So first, just to get us acquainted with the BLM, the Bureau of Land Management. It's a bureau within the Department of the Interior, manages surface lands and is responsible for the nation's mineral rights or subsurface estate. The BLM manages the subsurface rights on approximately 700 million acres of federal, state, tribal, private, and private lands, or the equivalent of about one out of every 3 acres in the country. And as you can see on the map, the vast majority of those surface and mineral acres are out here in the West. So before 1920, the extraction of these subsurface minerals was all governed by the General Mining Law of 1872. The General Mining Law dictates that all public lands of the U.S. are open for the extraction of their minerals by private individuals or companies by filing a claim to those minerals, and that's that process of staking a claim. The General Mining Law does not have a provision that allows the federal government to collect royalties, which is basically a tax that is assessed on the sale of the final product that gets sold, that gets extracted and sold on the market. And that's a tax basically to ensure that the actual owners of that mineral, the American public, get some sort of compensation for the activity of extracting and selling it. The General Mining Law is actually still the law of the land when it comes to filing a claim and extracting hard rock minerals in the United States on our public lands like gold, copper, silver, etc. So in the spring of 1920, Congress actually passed the Mineral Leasing Act. And this at the time was a new law that created specific processes for the management and leasing of federal oil, gas, and coal reserves. The motivating factor for its passage, again, were those royalties to ensure that the federal government, i.e. you and me, the American public, were able to collect our share of the profits from that private individuals and companies were generating from our public resources. With the absolute explosion of the oil and gas industry at the turn of the century, the U.S. federal government was concerned that the government, and therefore the public, weren't getting a fair return on the development and sale of US-owned oil and gas. It just didn't seem fair for private companies to make a ton of money off of publicly owned resources and not pay the public for those resources. So the Mineral Leasing Act set the royalty rate for federal onshore oil and gas at 12.5%. And that is still the royalty rate today, again, as of recording in April 2020. The Mineral Leasing Act authorizes the Secretary of the Interior to offer land that is known or believed to contain oil or gas deposits. In 1920, we didn't really know where a lot of oil and gas deposits were without some sort of meaningful exploration, sort of think like There Will Be Blood or Beverly Hillbillies. So in effect, all mineral interests were leasable because everything could feasibly be believed to contain oil or gas. An important takeaway, though, is that the Secretary is authorized but not explicitly mandated under the Mineral Leasing Act to develop oil and gas. So under this 1920 provision, lands that we did in fact know had oil or gas were considered to contain known geologic structures of a producing field, which is a known field of play where oil or gas deposits exist in a manner that are technologically and economically recoverable. These were places where production basically was already taking place. So we knew for a fact that oil or gas was there because there was a drill or a rig on that land. These obviously were safer places for companies to invest in and develop because there wasn't a risk that oil or gas might not be there or be recoverable with the technology of the day. And therefore, companies were a lot more willing to invest more money in a lease because potential for return was all but guaranteed. So these parcels were leased via a competitive leasing bidding process where companies would bid against one another to offer the highest price for the lease. Obviously, the industry in 1920 was not nearly as advanced as it is today 100 years later. And because we didn't know where all of the deposits were, or they weren't necessarily recoverable in an economic or technologically feasible way, a lot of the land did not contain this known geologic structure. This was basically anywhere where a drill or a rig didn't currently exist. So these lands, which actually made up the bulk of public lands and therefore the bulk of leased parcels, were leased non-competitively. And these were leased via a lottery. So companies would submit bids for the price that they would pay for a lease. And those were just kind of chosen at random by the BLM to receive this mineral lease, which is a really significant interest in public land. In fact, 93% of leases issued under this regime were issued through a non-competitive process. Again, they were just like chosen randomly out of a hat. So 93% of leased public lands starting in 1920 were leased with no meaningful way to ensure smart economic return to taxpayers and to ensure meaningful oversight of the industry. Choosing private companies to receive significant property rights on our public lands sort of at random is not a good way to ensure meaningful management of publicly owned resources and fair returns to the public for the development of those resources. So now we're going to jump ahead a little bit to the 1970s and talk about a law of more general applicability that plays a really big role in federal land and mineral management. Obviously, a lot of environmental laws were passed in the 1960s and 70s that impact federal oil and gas leasing and development. Obviously, NEPA was one, the National Environmental Policy Act. Other really important laws were the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act. Those all have implications for leasing and development, but that's not the focus of what we're talking about today. What we really want to talk about today is the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, and that was passed in 1976. FLPMA, as it's commonly called, has two key takeaways for this discussion. First, FLPMA requires the Forest Service and the BLM to prepare land planning documents that will guide the local offices in their management activities. I like to think of these things, these forest plans on the Forest Service, and they're called resource management plans or RMPs on the BLM side. I think of those as zoning codes. They set the standards by which site-specific activities and projects will be made over the life of the plan. What sorts of activities like logging, road and trail maintenance, mountain biking, and management for wilderness qualities will all be allowed, and where and how those activities will be managed. Because the BLM under the Mineral Leasing Act is charged with overseeing the federal mineral estate, BLM RMPs also have to determine what lands and what mineral interests will be available for oil and gas leasing, as well as other management prescriptions for such leasing. You may have heard of controlled surface occupancy and no surface occupancy stipulations. Those are determined in RMPs, as well as seasonal limitations on surface disturbing activities. FLPMA also introduced a really important, widely misunderstood and widely misconstrued concept of multiple use. In a very basic sense, multiple use is the idea that federal public lands contain an array of exceedingly valuable resources and experiences, and it's the job of the federal managing agency to figure out how to balance all of those interests, which can often contradict. But at the end of the day, these lands and resources, They belong to the American public, and managing them to meet a broad, diverse set of needs and desires of that public is the goal of multiple use. I want to draw your attention to the phrases that are bolded, italicized, and underlined on the screen. Minerals is only listed in there once against a whole bunch of conservation values or ecosystem service values. Yes, minerals are explicitly stated here, but it's also very clear that federal land management is not just about commodities. Federal lands are not supposed to be managed solely to turn a profit or to generate economic activity in a particular sector of the economy. So then we're going to jump ahead about 10 years to the Federal Onshore Oil and Gas Leasing Reform Act of 1987. So again, we're going to go back to oil and gas leasing now, which up until 1987 had been trucking along largely unchanged since 1920. The non-competitive program from the 1920 MLA was roundly criticized by watchdog groups and the General Accountability Office of the federal government for, quote, encouraging fraud, misleading the public, and generating insufficient revenues. The GAO also found that the BLM, quote, has long known that the leasing system was subject to fraud and abuse, and that the BLM was not taking enough care in protecting the environment affected by development of federal oil and gas leases. So one particularly egregious example of this encouraging fraud, misleading the public, and generating insufficient revenues took place in 1983. The BLM opted to sell leases in Wyoming non-competitively, even though there was significant data available that revealed that the area had high oil and gas potential. The BLM collected $1.2 million in fees for 14 leases in the area, and the winner immediately turned around and resold those leases closer to market value to another private company for upwards of $100 million. So that $100 million was profit to that first private company that purchased the land from the federal, or purchased the interest from the federal government for $1.2 million. The federal government didn't get any benefit of that $100 million market value. So in 1987, Congress finally made some amendments to the MLA, and this was the first set of major amendments since 1920, aimed at reforming this competitive and non-competitive leasing processes. So under these amendments, leases for all federal lands, quote, known to contain oil or gas deposits must first be offered through a competitive bidding process. So that, again, is that bidding process that companies submit bids against each other. And the idea is that under a competitive market, the highest price offered will be the winner, driving up the price to best reflect the market value of the lease and thus get the best return on that lease sale for you and me, for taxpayers, for public land users. For oil and gas leases, that would mean, in theory, at least, the companies would have to pay a price that best reflected the market value. And again, thus returning the highest, most reasonable rates to federal and state treasuries. So the Federal Onshore Oil and Gas Leasing Reform Act instituted the current system whereby parcels are offered basically in an auction first, but it retained the flavor of non-competitive leasing that the industry really liked from the 1920 Act by instituting an off-the-shelf lease purchasing mechanism for any parcels that weren't first sold during this competitive auction. The Act set the minimum bid price for competitive leasing, that first round of leasing, at $2 per acre. And the prices issued non-competitively at a standard set price of $1.50 per acre instead of the random lottery. This set of amendments also instituted some more environmental protections like bonding, and it also instituted some more public processes about notice and comment requirements. And 1987, that was actually the last time that the Mineral Leasing Act was amended or updated by Congress. So those $2 per acre price for minimum bid for competitive leasing and $1.50 per acre for an off-the-shelf purchase of federal mineral interests is still the law of the land. And I don't know about you guys, but I don't know anywhere in Montana where I can buy land for $2 an acre or $1.50 an acre. So lease sales, let's go over those now. The basic process of a lease sale seems fairly standard, but it actually puts companies in the driver's seat from the very get-go. Lease sales must be held nationally every 3 months, every quarter. So it's a standard, routine, and super predictable schedule that happens multiple times a year. Parcels that have been deemed suitable for leasing through a BLM field office's RMP can be nominated to be included in a lease sale. Parcels can be nominated by anybody, but most often these nominations are made by those who have a stake in getting them in that lease sale process, the extraction companies, the oil and gas companies. Nominations can actually be made anonymously, so there's an incentive right from the get-go for companies to really hide their real motivations and their real intentions. And because these nominations can be anonymous, there's no way to track to make sure whoever nominated the parcels, who gets them into the process, actually ends up taking part in the competitive bidding process. Companies have used this as a way to intentionally mislead the BLM and other companies about their true interests and to obscure what parcels are truly valuable or not. The BLM has to review parcels, but that review is somewhat procedural because, again, the land was already determined through a really robust RMP planning process to be suitable for oil and gas leasing, and therefore the assumption going into the review is that that suitability stands. The BLM does have to notify the public of lease sales and what parcels will be included, and must give the public the opportunity to provide comment on those parcels. Under the Trump administration, public review and comment period has been slashed to a mere 10 days. The public has just 10 days to review what can often be tens of thousands of acres of land and provide thoughtful, substantive comment on that land's value. These quarterly lease sales where parcels are first available for competitive leasing. Leases, whether issued competitively or non-competitively, are issued for an initial term of 10 years. If at the end of that 10-year base lease, the lease ends up producing something in recoverable amounts, that lease is extended indefinitely, so long as the lease is producing oil and gas. If the lease isn't producing by the end of that 10-year base term, the company can simply walk away, or they can choose to extend the lease by 2-year terms simply by continuing to pay rent. So rental rates. Rental rates on these mineral leases are the same whether the lease is issued competitively or non-competitively. Rent is just $1.50 per acre for the first 5 years of a lease, and then it goes up to $2 per acre for every year after that. That 12.5 royalty rate that was set in 1920, that's only assessed once production of the lease is such that the 12.5% royalty rate would be greater than the rental rate. Okay, so competitive leasing. How well does it actually work out in terms of assuring the highest price is received for our public resources when it's leased to private companies? Turns out, not so great. Significant amounts of land available during lease sales often only sells for that minimum $2 bid. Again, that has not been updated since 1987. If a parcel receives a bid from a bidder, even if it's just that $2 minimum bid and no bonus bid, nothing above that, the BLM has to issue that lease. They cannot hold back a lease because the final price at auction is lower than what the BLM or the public believes is the fair market value of the land to be. Furthermore, there's a lot of land that goes without getting even the minimum bid during these competitive sales. Remember, companies can nominate whatever they want. So they can nominate a whole slew of land, and if it makes it into the hopper for these lease sales, that's a ton of land to cover in an auction. More and more land is being offered in quarterly lease sales under the Trump administration, and that glut of supply results in lower overall bid rates. We're seeing an upward trend across the country in the number of acres that receive only the minimum bid, and an upward trend of acres that go without a bid at this competitive stage at all. So remember, companies have a huge incentive from the start to nominate a ton of land and then only to make a minimum bid or to sit out that process entirely. They can wait until the very next day to take advantage of non-competitive leasing. So parcels that are left over after the competitive process are then available the very next day for anyone to literally walk into a BLM office and hand over or mail in a check for $1.50 per acre and the nominal filing fee. These parcels are available on the shelf like this for the next 2 years, and if they still go on lease after 2 years, the BLM can just loop them back into the competitive lease sale process and start all over again. So companies don't even have to participate in the competitive process to be eligible for non-competitive leasing. Basically, a company has all the incentive to anonymously nominate parcels to be considered in a lease sale and game the system by not bidding or even registering to bid during the competitive sale, and then swoop in the very next day to buy the same 10-year lease without any pretense of competition and paying just $1.50 per acre. In fact, according to a recent report by the Center for American Progress, about 2 million acres across the country have gone unsold and become available non-competitively since 2017. As a result, the number of acres leased non-competitively has more than doubled from 2017 to 2018, from approximately 141,000 acres to nearly 400,000 acres, marking a 10-year high in 2018. According to that same report from Center for American Progress, about a quarter of leases issued over the past 10 years were issued non-competitively, totaling nearly 3 million acres across the West. So in other words, in the last decade alone, the amount of land nearly the size of Connecticut has been leased non-competitively. The problem is widespread across the West, but Montana and Nevada have emerged as unfortunately, the winners in this process. In Montana, we've seen a huge increase in non-competitive leasing, and it's caused the average bid to fall by 80% compared with the final years of the Obama administration. So in Montana, over 260,000 acres were leased non-competitively from 2009 to 2018. Since 1987, when this system of competitive and non-competitive leasing was offered and those base prices were set, almost half of all of our leases have been issued for $2 or less. Thinking about it sort of in comparison to other states across the country, 18% of leases issued nationally in 2018 were acquired non-competitively, but 72% of leases issued in Montana were acquired non-competitively, and that covered almost 100,000 acres of public land. So then putting that in comparison again, between 2014 and 2018, Montana public lands accounted for 8% of the public lands available for lease in national sales, but accounted for nearly 38% of all non-competitive leases issued nationally. So this uptick that we're seeing in non-competitive leasing is largely driven by Montana and also Nevada. And that's not all. Leases issued this way have a much higher chance of not leading to developing, i.e. royalty paying returns. And these parcels also have significantly higher rates of companies defaulting on the leases, meaning they don't even pay the minimal yearly rental rates or otherwise break terms of their leases. And the BLM then has to go through the process of evicting these squatters from our public lands. As you can see on this chart, that's also from the Center for American Progress. Leases issued competitively by the end of their base term have about a 10% chance of producing in royalties for the American public. Leases issued non-competitively, only 3% of them end up producing in recoverable amounts that royalties can be assessed on. That's a huge, huge difference between those leases issued competitively, those parcels that probably have really significant oil and gas interests, and those leases issued non-competitively, those lands that were not interesting enough, did not have enough potential to gain a competitive bid. The termination rate, again, that ending of a lease early for failure to pay rent, that's the most common reason why leases are ended early. Competitively issued leases, about 30% of them have to be terminated for breaking a lease. But about 55% of non-competitively issued leases have to be terminated early by the BLM. The number of acres leased non-competitively, it fluctuates every year, but it's on the rise under the Trump administration. From 2017 to 2018, as we saw on the last slide, the acres sold non-competitively more than doubled. And this bump in part is due to the fact that the Trump administration is offering more and more land for lease. About 2 million acres since 2017 has gone unsold at auction and then is immediately available for non-competitive leasing. This is not at all a judicious use of federal resources, both in terms of the land available and in the BLM's time in preparing, administering, and monitoring these leases, as well as foregoing all of the other opportunities and all of the other multiple uses that those public lands could see. So obviously the next question is why? Why has this been going on? One can imagine a scenario where this secondary non-competitive leasing process might be justified. If lease sales were such a rare occurrence that years could pass before companies can bid on the parcels, if it's difficult to nominate parcels for auction in response to more favorable market conditions or technological advances that change a company's investment calculations, or if the government needs to incentivize leasing to meet our nation's energy needs. But none of these scenarios are applicable. The BLM, for its duration of its existence and the existence of the federal oil and gas leasing program, has run an industry-first leasing system where anyone at any time for free can anonymously nominate a parcel of land and kick this leasing process into gear. Outside of the BLM's cursory environmental review of a parcel's nomination, there are very few parameters on what public land the oil and gas industry can access or when. Lease sales occur several times a year at regular intervals, so it's not as if companies need to swoop in and scoop up as many leases as they can in one go, as one might argue if these lease sales were held far less often. They can carefully plan out their investments and their strategies and do their own research into the potential of resource fields and their own capacities. The BLM has actually testified in front of Congress that changing the lease sale process by eliminating non-competitive leasing or increasing rental rates, royalty rates, or bid rates would go against their policy to reduce unnecessary and burdensome regulations. Quote, reform could impact the competitive nature of the lease sale process and hurt state returns. Quote, likewise, decreasing the frequency of lease sales has the potential to reduce return to U.S. taxpayers as market demand from industry fluctuates and opportunities for industry to obtain leases decreases. However, numerous independent studies have indicated that returns to states would actually increase with updated reforms and that the industry wouldn't suffer in terms of less access or less favorable market conditions. The industry actually pays higher royalty rates all the time. Drilling on state lands often has higher royalty rates across the country, including here in Montana. And private mineral interest owners can actually negotiate directly with companies for royalty rates that far exceed the federal royalty rate, often as high as 25%. So again, independent studies have shown no correlation between increasing royalty rates, increasing yearly rental rates, and lease purchase rates, and any decrease in extractive output. Companies in the BLM have also argued that the price of oil and gas could be more expensive for consumers down the line if the leasing process is changed. Basically, that any increase to the cost of doing business would be passed on to consumers rather than passed on to oil and gas executives. But because the complex global oil and gas market is actually largely driven by international states, what's actually driving the price of oil and gas is not the BLM policy. So this argument also fails to hold significant water as a meaningful reason not to reform our system. Arguments about the importance of, quote, open markets during lease sale processes have been unequivocally refuted by the BLM itself in recent weeks. In March 2020, a BLM spokesperson said that, quote, using an all above the board's approach to energy development, we are helping to meet our nation's growing energy needs by facilitating development and letting free market forces work after the resources extracted by companies who sell these commodities. So the process of offering record amounts of land for sale, regardless of development potential, for lease sales with bid prices far below market value, and the opportunity to not even make a bid, it almost entirely insulates the lease sale process from the forces of the free market. It's basically a giant subsidy for oil and gas companies. Leases issued non-competitively are often issued in areas that do not have significant or even moderate potential for future development. 90% of federal lands are available for leasing, but certainly 90% of our federal lands are not akin to the Bakken or the Jonah Field of Wyoming in terms of geologic structures. Companies are going to pay more. They're going to make a bigger investment in areas that have serious potential for development. They'll pay less for areas that aren't available, or they'll pay less for areas that are available but don't have much potential because these parcels boost their portfolios. They artificially inflate their portfolios, and that in turn attracts investors. That's complete speculation. These companies pay rock bottom prices for our public lands that are used to bolster their own holdings to secure investment in projects elsewhere. An entire industry has actually sprung up to take advantage of cheap leases on public lands, including those available through non-competitive leasing. A New York Times article recently revealed a really interesting anecdote that took place here in Montana. In 2017, a London-based company, Highlands Natural Resources, nominated tens of thousands of acres for lease in Montana, hoping that no one would bid on them during auction. No one did, so the company was able to scoop them up the following day for $1.50 per acre. Highlands is now seeking investors for a, quote, prospective opportunity to develop the area for natural gas and helium. So again, being able to acquire vast amount of public land onto their private books, it gives these companies an opportunity to bolster their balance sheets, and it superficially inflates their market value, making them more attractive to shareholders and investors. And this is possible thanks to a 2008 shift in the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission policy, which is far more complicated than I can possibly explain. But basically, at the end of the day, the industry has operated under these general conditions for 100 years, and they don't want to change the way they do business because the business is in their favor. The BLM has allowed the industry to dictate the terms of our federal oil and gas leasing for as long as we've been leasing federal oil and gas to private companies. Plain and simple, they don't want to do business any differently because it's how they've always done it. They don't want to give us fair return for our resources because they've never had to do it in the past. So a lot of MWA members and conservationists ask why NGOs and nonprofits and people like them aren't buying up these leases to prevent them from going into the hands of the oil and gas industry. In theory, yes, any adult individual can obtain a federal lease for oil and gas. But the catch is that the BLM enforces it in such a way that there needs to be a stated interest and some capacity on paper to develop those leases. Ultimately, what happens is that the everyday individual and conservation nonprofits cannot be a part of the lease sale process. Only individuals and companies who are citizens of the US, either your individual personhood or the corporation has US citizenship because it is incorporated here. So international companies that operate in the US have to incorporate basically a shell company here. They also have to have a stated business interest in developing oil and gas resources and can demonstrate on paper, at least, that they have the assets to a lease. They don't have to have the cash, but they just have to have some numbers on a paper that theoretically look like they can develop those resources. And that's called the diligent development requirement. Finally, these companies and individuals have to be registered with the BLM through a third-party company that actually conducts lease sales online. So as you can see, it's kind of a complicated process for just you and me to try to take advantage of. And actually about 12 years ago, activist Tim DeChristopher, who at the time was a student at the University of Utah, attempted to thwart in-person sales by bidding on leases in Salt Lake City. He did not have the millions of dollars to pay for the leases that he ultimately was successful bidding on. And he was charged and convicted of fraud, and he actually spent about 21 months in a federal prison. Shortly thereafter, Terry Tempest Williams and other activists continued in Tim's spirit, and they bid on leases at another bid sale. But this time, Terry Tempest Williams and her husband, Brooke, actually had the cash to be able to buy the leases. But the BLM has since revoked those leases because the Williams' stated interest in developing their resources doesn't align with how the agency interprets development. So since these two rabble-rousers infiltrated those in-person sales, that's when the BLM moved to that online-only platform with these pre-registration requirements, specifically to prevent these types of sit-ins and these disruptions by the public. Lease sales are entirely conducted online through that third-party website, and you can't just walk into that online forum the day of either. Again, companies and individuals have to be pre-registered by this third party and vetted to be able to come into a lease sale. So in effect, lease sales are not open to the public. So that's why MWA and other organizations and other individuals aren't buying lease sales. It's because we really can't. Okay, so we're gonna take a step back now, and we're gonna kind of reformulate and try to bring everything together. So again, we started off in 1920, 100 years ago, with the setting of royalty rates and the setup of that competitive versus non-competitive leasing process. We also got NEPA in 1969, which was a really important law. Federal Mineral Leasing Act in 1976, again, that requires the BLM to come up with these RMPs that determine the suitability of land for leasing. And those RMPs guide decisions for 20 to 30 years. FLPMA is also where we got that multiple use mandate. Then jumping ahead about 10 years to the Federal Onshore Oil and Gas Leasing Reform Act of 1987. That set up the process whereby all parcels must first be available for competitive leasing and then go to that off-the-shelf non-competitive leasing process. So then quick review of lease sales and the actual leases offered quarterly. Industry gets to nominate. Competitive bid is just $2 an acre. Leftover parcels can be leased non-competitively for 2 years after that for just $1.50 an acre. We still have that 12.5% royalty rate, and we have really low rental rates of $1.50 per acre for the first 5 years of a 10-year lease, and then $2 an acre for all of the years after that. All right, so moving on. Land, again, is determined suitable for oil and gas leasing during an RMP planning process, during the process of coming up with an RMP. So again, those RMPs are in effect for 20, sometimes even 30 years. So determinations made 20 plus years ago are still being put into motion today. And that means that decisions made today are going to impact public lands for years to come in the future. The general framework in these planning processes is that land is open unless closed. So land is generally available and open to all uses, including suitability for future oil and gas leasing, unless the agency affirmatively closes that land or it's found affirmatively unsuitable. So for that, so that's part of how so much land gets put into the process of oil and gas leasing. So this map from the Wilderness Society is from 2016. The data has changed a tiny bit, and Montana's number has actually shifted slightly, but not significantly. Other states have actually seen the amount of land open to leasing increase under RMPs passed by the Trump administration. So across the West, 90% of our public lands are available for leasing or are already leased. Of that 90% of public lands that are available, 26 million acres of leased land, about the size of Indiana, are sitting idle. They're not producing anything. They're not generating royalties. They're not creating jobs. 66%, well over half of currently active leases in Montana are sitting idle. Again, meaning that they are not producing oil and gas. They're not generating royalties. They're not job sites for our community members. And they're locked up from other meaningful management, other multiple use management. So that brings us to a question that we get a lot is like, so there's a lease and it's not being developed. Like, what does it matter? Once that right to develop property is transferred to the company, that property interest, it's nearly impossible to prevent development if the company decides to explore. that handing over of that lease that says that you have the right to this mineral interest and you have the right to do what you want with it, it's incredibly significant. And that right to develop is going to end up trumping other surface uses where they conflict. So that means that the BLM really cannot effectively manage for other multiple uses, including access, habitat, and recreation. Those management stipulations that we talked about before, including controlled surface use, no surface occupancy, and seasonal limitations, we can think of those not as preventing development, but rather, or preventing degradation, but rather just trying to mitigate it. It's not about stopping development, it's about mitigating the effects of it. At the end of the day, though, this literally puts our public lands into private hands. Private companies dictate how our public lands are managed, and we don't even get a fair return for their activities. So we're going to talk a little bit about money here. From 2009 to 2019, 955,000 acres were leased to private companies for oil and gas development in Montana. So leases, so that it's low potential leases, they're the ones that are cheap and easy to acquire. These are the ones that are often issued non-competitively. They're also the ones that are often sold for near the minimum bid of $2 an acre. Again, because of their low development potential, they are really unlikely to actually produce oil and gas and generate royalties for the American taxpayers. Again, companies are charged just that yearly rate of $1.50 per acre and then a $2 per acre rental rate for the lease. And that's it. Those royalties are only assessed, those royalties of 12.5%, those are only assessed on produced oil once it's higher than the rental rate. So non-producing leases, which we saw on the last slide, account for a tremendous amount of the leases in the West and in Montana particularly. They do not create jobs for our local communities. If there's no action taking place, there's no need to spend money to employ our friends and our neighbors, negating any argument from the companies that they need cheap access to land to create jobs. But what we do see is that outdoor recreation, including hunting, is quickly growing in Montana. In fact, it's one of our largest economic drivers, and it's becoming increasingly and particularly important in more rural counties. At the end of the day, our public land is managed at the will and for the benefit of private companies, and it has cost Montanans millions of dollars in lost opportunity revenue. Because states are entitled to about 50% of proceeds from leases, including bids, rental rates, and royalties, mismanagement of our public resources for less than fair market returns has cost Montana communities. Taxpayers for Common Sense has estimated in a recent report that over the last decade, these outdated fiscal policies, including non-competitive leasing, has cost Montana $110 million. That's $110 million that our local schools, highway systems, and community development programs have lost out on at the benefit of private companies. So now let's kind of put all of this into a landscape, and what does it really mean for landscape? So now we're going to talk about the Lewistown BLM planning area in central Montana. In the summer of 2019, the BLM issued a draft environmental impact statement and a draft resource management plan for this area. And in the late winter, early spring, the BLM issued a final draft resource management plan for this area. So it's about 650,000 acres of surface land. About 200,000 acres of that has been identified as having wilderness characteristics. And obviously a lot of it is up in that northeast corner of the planning area, along the confluence of the Missouri and the Musselshell River, right next to the Charles M. Russell National Wildlife Refuge, and also adjacent to the Upper Missouri River Breaks National Monument. So if you haven't been, it's the best that Montana has to offer. It's incredibly beautiful. It's one of the last remaining intact and complex prairie and grassland systems, as well as a fairly intact mountain to prairie ecosystem. Some key landscapes, again, along the Musselshell and Missouri rivers, immediately adjacent to that CMR refuge and the Upper Missouri River Breaks National Monument. These landscapes are home to some of the most robust elk herds in the lower 48 and incredibly productive habitat for world-class herds of mule deer, as well as sage grouse. It's incredibly varied, really the best of all of the things that Montana, has to offer. It goes all the way up to the Rocky Mountain front, and also includes the Judith Mountains just outside of Lewistown. So you have the prairies, the grasslands, the breaks, the badlands, and the impressive Rocky Mountain front, all that's managed by the field office out of Lewistown. So like we said, 650,000 acres of surface area, but 1.2 million acres of federal, i.e. public, mineral estate. These subsurface property interests, they're all under the 650,000 surface acres, plus a lot of acres under privately owned lands and state trust land. These are called split estates, which is a whole other beast when it comes to oil and gas leasing that we unfortunately do not have time for. But just know that it's 1.2 million acres of federal mineral estate that the Lewistown BLM is responsible for managing and for figuring out if it's suitable for oil and gas leasing and therefore impacting those surface lands, or if the other available multiple uses on those surface lands might be a little bit more important than suitability for oil and gas leasing. All right, so what are we working with? As part of the RMP process, the BLM, with the help of the U.S. Geologic Service, developed a reasonably foreseeable development scenario, an RFD, where they examined data about existing geologic structures and historical and existing extractive activities, as well as congressional land protections to figure out what the development of a potential area looks like over the life of the RMP. So this map that we're looking at right now shows the underlying geologic structures in that area. We can see some significant oil plays along the Rocky Mountain front, but otherwise the actual geology of the area it's not the best. It's really nothing to write home about. It's not significant. Again, particularly pay attention to the areas in the northeast corner of the map right next to the CMR. Those are those areas that the BLM has determined have outstanding wilderness characteristics. So this map is also from the RFD, and it is a projection of how many wells and rigs the BLM actually projects there being throughout the planning area over the next 20 to 30 years. The vast majority of the planning area is characterized by the BLM as having very little to negligible potential for even one well per township. Despite these findings of low and no potential, nearly all of this mineral estate would be open to the oil and gas industry, and no acres would be protected for their wilderness value or for wildlife habitat. Public land does not need to contain feasible or reasonable potential for future production to be considered suitable for leasing. The BLM declared in their draft revised resource management plan for this central Montana planning area that 91% of the mineral estate would be suitable for future oil and gas sales, despite the fact that the majority of this land has little to no potential for any development that would result in recoverable oil or gas. That's the fuel that enters the economy and could provide income in the form of royalty payments for those companies to county governments. This combination of a land plan that would allow so much public land to be sold to private companies and a lack of recoverable oil and gas potential in those same lands is the perfect storm for non-competitive leasing in these lands in the future. We already know that Montana is ground zero for non-competitive leasing, and this RMP is setting up the process for Montana to be taken even more advantage of in the non-competitive leasing process. Companies can buy these leases for $1.50 an acre in these non-competitive leases, again, usually on land with low and no potential, to inflate their holdings, artificially boost their portfolios, and attract investment to their private bank accounts. It's simply good old-fashioned land speculation, but it's done at the expense of our public lands and the ability to manage those lands for anything other than these companies' privately held rights on our public lands. In central Montana, in the Lewistown BLM planning area, that means that some of the last intact diverse grasslands in North America that are home to the healthiest herds of elk, mule deer, and pronghorn in the lower 48 could be held by private companies for pennies on the dollar in return to taxpayers, preventing the BLM from meaningfully managing these areas for wilderness values, for quiet recreation, for backcountry hunting, wildlife viewing, clean air, clean water, and view sheds that our communities depend on and that make our way of life in Montana possible. So, what can we do about all of this? We're asking folks to add their name to an open letter to Senators Jon Tester and Steve Daines here in 2020 to support two pieces of legislation that have been introduced by other senators. The Fair Returns for Public Lands Act of 2020 and the End Speculative Oil and Gas Leasing Act of 2020. These two bills together would fix some pretty significant loopholes in our current oil and gas leasing system by increasing minimum bid rates, rental rates, and royalty rates, as well as prohibiting the BLM from finding land from finding land that has been deemed in an RFD as low and no potential, finding that land suitable for future leasing, just keeping it out of the leasing system altogether. But to really seal the deal, we need a bill to specifically end non-competitive leasing. So we're asking Senators Jon Tester and Steve Daines to step up, support S 3330 and S 3203, as well as step up as leaders and introduce a bill specifically to end non-competitive leasing. Another really big way that you can take action to help us out here is to donate to MWA. We're a 501c3, we're a nonprofit, but more importantly, we are a community of people who care about and take action for Montana's public lands and wild spaces. We need funds to keep this campaign going. We have really big plans to build a movement that includes you that can't be ignored. And we're gonna need this movement if we're going to reform a system that is 100 years old and caters to some of the most powerful industry interests in the world. We can't do this without you. And so I'd like to invite each of you who are watching this to invest in this work. Maybe you're able to give $5 a month. Maybe you're able to give $10 a month. Maybe a one-time donation works better for you. But give what you can. It'll just take 2 minutes and you'll be really glad that you pitched in. So I know that was a lot. I know that was a long recording. I really appreciate you sticking with me. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. My email is abertram@wildmontana.org. My office phone is 406-530-9639. And you can also go online to our website, www.wildmontana.org, to learn more. So again, thank you so much for watching. Feel free to reach out if you have questions. I really appreciate you being here. Thanks so much.